Good evening, everyone. This is a meeting of the Policy Subcommittee of the School Committee. We are joined by Mary Ellen Norman for staff today, as well as Casey Neal Miller. We are going to be reviewing or discussing rather several policies that we will then proceed to work on drafts for them. But to lead off for today, we have review approval of the minutes of the December 14th Policy Review Subcommittee meeting. Have the members had an opportunity to review the minutes?
Yes.
All right, would someone like to move them?
I'll move them.
Okay, do we have a second?
I second.
All right, Andy,
Yes.
Dimitri,
Yes.
Jennifer,
Yes.
and I also vote yes. Okay, next up, we have an update on attendance procedures. So the reason that I put this on the agenda is because it had been brought to our attention about a month ago that there were some parents expressing concerns about how our students were being marked with respect to the reasons for their absence, whether it was excused or unexcused, whether they should be marked absent at all if they're engaged remotely. So just seeking some follow-up on where that currently stands. So is that something that perhaps you have for us, Casey?
Sure. I think if you're referencing what I think you are with regard to a parent concern that was expressed to the state.
Yep.
You just give me a minute and pull it up, but I do think that a determination was made by the state. I'm not exactly sure what it was. Again, I'll find it for you, but the result of that was a change in our attendance reporting requirements, where previously students were, I believe, marked unexcused absent, are now going to be reported as, I believe, again, I'll find it for you, but I think it's remotely present, I believe, but I'll get you the specific terminology.
And just in terms of the input that you're receiving from parents, do you think that there's greater comfort with how students are currently being marked? So one issue that had been raised by Aaron was that there needs to be at least a half day of learning taking place in order to be marked as present. Have there been any changes around that in terms of how we quantify a half day?
No, there have not been any changes. And to your first question, and again, I don't receive Erin's emails, although she is on maternity leave starting this week, so I may start seeing some of them forwarded to me. So I don't know to what extent families are feeling comforted by this change. But teachers are, teachers are being asked to report on first, or to assess whether or not the student was present for a half day of learning before marking them absent or present.
Okay. And do we know
Virtually present is the term.
All right. And is there some kind of formalized mechanism by which teachers report whether they have seen a student to be virtually present half a day? Is there some kind of frequency by which they have to report to someone? And if so, to whom do they report? Is it to their principal? Is it to someone in the central office?
So families should continue to report attendance in the way that they would if schools were fully open. And then staff will take attendance at the beginning of the day, usually during morning meeting. That's not a change there. And then student attendance will be recorded based on the instruction that they're receiving or their cohort or learning model. And then there is a message that will be sent out to families to let students know that to let parents know that how students are being marked absent.
Okay.
Casey, do we have, I guess what I'm trying to understand is, do we have a huge, I've been reading about some schools district was struggling with issues of absenteeism,
Mhm,
right? So students are not present for so much
mhm.
of the online classes that they are, it's affecting their grades and therefore, struggling with how do you, are we, it doesn't, I don't think we're struggling with a similar issue, but is that where the attendance policy might actually impact students?
Yeah, so I think what you're talking about is something a little bit different. So we do have a high number of student absence, and a lot of that we suspect, and this is me hearing from Maria Litas, who oversees the guidance department, that students aren't accessing for a number of reasons related to their home life. I think that is different. So those numbers are high, especially at the high school level, so the middle school to high school level. With this issue about being virtually present and virtually absent, we have families whose children are in the hybrid model, who on their in-person days are electing to not send their students in.
Mm,
And we have set windows for when families can switch learning models. And families are doing this before, we suspect that these are the same families who want to go into RLA, but the window hasn't opened yet. And so the way that I believe Erin and her team were reading the guidance from the state was that we would mark these students absent. But of course, those absences build up, which has a different implication regulations wise. And families were, questioning that practice. And I think that's what you're talking about, right, David?
Yes. So a similar question to Dimitri. So when a student accumulates 10 absences in short succession, a district is supposed to file what's called a CRA, petition, children requiring assistance. And I'm just wondering if we have any rough idea around the numbers of whether those have been filed, or if we hopefully don't even get to that point because there are discussions with the families of students who would be otherwise affected.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure, but we can certainly bring Megan Gainey in, who oversees the Office of Registration and Enrollment, to let you know how many students we have who have racked up 10 or more absences, to start there. And then we can talk more about what schools are doing for those students, whether or not they are filing the CRAs.
Okay. Any further questions or comments about attendance procedures and potential implications for policies?
Casey, is there a reason why for those families who are, they are in hybrid, clearly they would like to be in RLA, because of the way we're operating, is there a reason why they must wait for when we're reopening RLA? Why is that not a fluid process where, oh, okay, well, if you want to switch, we can switch you now? Like, I'm assuming if I needed to move out of Brookline next week and move into a new community, my kids would have to go into the new community, right? So is there a reason why we cannot make it fluid within the district?
Sure. I think a lot of it first has to do with scheduling.
Okay.
So for school leaders, figuring out which class the student would go into,
Okay.
and then the teacher having to follow up on where that student is with the
Yeah.
curriculum and different content areas. And then if you're a student who receives services, English language learner services, special education services, you would likely have a different team of providers. So they do need some lead time to prepare to receive that student. So
Right.
could we plop that student into the class? Absolutely. But does it mean that the adults working with those kids would be prepared? No.
Yeah.
And then also there's just a numbers piece too, right? So if it's a fluid process, there's a lot of the administrative workload, I suspect would increase pretty substantially.
Okay.
To your question, David, though, about the attendance policy, I know it's a little bit different because this is about reporting attendance. I do know I just came from the principals meeting. We have a meeting every Monday afternoon. And one of the things that they did talk about was, I think for a few years now, they've been asking for policy subcommittee to review our attendance policy in general. And so that might be, something for you to think about too.
Was there any specific input from principals around where they might like to see some adjustments to attendance policy?
Yeah, my impression is that our attendance policy as it stands is somewhat lenient in that I think, and again, I don't know the specifics, but I think it makes it easy for kids to miss a lot of school before there are some consequences.
And this is both at the K-8 level as well as high school, or did you see this more pronounced at one versus the other?
I think it's more pronounced at the high school, but we would have to dig in for some details. But I think you'd get a lot of support from the principals in terms of wanting to review the attendance policy. I know this is something that Nicole pushed for, but this I think is right before I came on, so I don't have a lot of context, but happy to gather them, obviously.
Okay. Any further thoughts on attendance? All right, seeing none, we'll move into a discussion of student grouping, inclusion, and placement practices. For those of you in the public who are following along, that can be found on page J19 of our policy handbook. This was last revised in 1997, part of it, and then another part in 2010. So I do think it's due for some updating, especially as we look to try to include more members of our student body, particularly those in special education. I'm a little concerned that with the way the current policy stands, there are some references to special education, certainly, but I think that there's definitely more that we could be doing to ensure that inclusion is meaningful for all of our students. I'm curious as to what the district's current practices are around placement in general. I did receive an email earlier today from a member of the public who solicited input from some administrators at one of the K-8 schools, and that was very helpful for me to review. But I'm wondering if we could get sort of a broad overview, perhaps, of how placement currently works, not necessarily just for special education, but for everyone. So what would be the starting place, and how do teacher assignments work? So if someone's prepared to give maybe just a broad overview, and I understand that specifics might come at a later point.
Sure, I can speak to this a little bit, but I do think it might be helpful to bring principals in to speak more specifically about this. So I can tell you that bless you, Jennifer, the class placement process is probably one of the most thoughtful processes and time consuming processes that school leaders, so principals and VPs and teachers engage in. And it's teachers that include special educators and English language teachers also. So I don't know exactly where the starting point is, but I can speak a little bit to the inputs that are taken into consideration. One is parent feedback. Each school generally has a form or some way for parents to let the school know certain preferences. So they may allow parents to list X number of students that they wish for their child to be with, and perhaps maybe some space to list some areas of concern for the group to consider as they're thinking about class placement. I know that another input is students receiving services. So to the inclusion piece, you never want to have a general education classroom where there are more students receive, let's say, with any subgroup than the breakdown at the school. So let's say at Lincoln, if we have a 20% special education population, you want that percentage to be represented accurately in any classroom. So you wouldn't have a second grade general education classroom, let's say, where 49% of the students are on IEPs. Similarly, the thought going into this too, I should say, is that all teachers should be able to teach all students. And so we will have some students who require more services, let's say And so you would spread them, you would distribute them equally across a grade. You take into consideration any previous substantiated bullying cases, or even actually those that have been unsubstantiated, but you know that they're, it could be concerning if you put, you know, the two students who previously had issues with each other in one class. Twins is another consideration. Siblings who happen to be in the same grade for whatever reason. What else have I mean, there are a number of inputs. Trying to think if there are any others, but there's our school teams iterate on that many times before they land on something final. One thing that I think seems to be a point of consternation with the public is that our schools don't always notify families don't always receive class placements at the same time. So some schools might do it right after school ends. Some schools hold off until the end of August. So I think we should probably discuss having a similar notification timeline from the K-8s as we're thinking about this policy. And potentially, and I don't know if this is procedure rather than policy, but what's the appeals process on the parent end if they are not satisfied with the assignment?
So looking at the policy itself, I notice in the fourth bullet point, so that's the bottom paragraph, there's one sentence that sounds slightly paradoxical to me. I understand there's sort of a tricky balance, but that sentence is, in order to create effective learning environments and maintain valued diversity within each classroom, efforts will be made to place students with some peers who share similar profiles so that teachers can more effectively address the strengths and needs of all students. So on the one hand, it's saying, let's be diverse, but on the other hand, it's saying, let's have people of a similar profile.
I don't know what the intention is of that one. I agree with you that it's paradoxical.
I can share with you a little bit about this one, David, because I have experienced this. So the way I understood, at least in my experience, was that in my case, my boys were two Black children in a predominantly white school. So they were intentionally making sure that every time they would place one of the boys in a class, that there would be another kid of color, or another kid of color that, you know, one of them at least knew, so some of their friends. You know, in the case of one of my boys who could be quite rambunctious, I was always like, oh, does it have to be with so-and-so? But it was like, well, you know, there's not that many, and that's one of his best friends. So it was things like that. So it was always the intention, at least for kids of color, to make sure that they're not always the only kid of color in the classroom.
Okay. Now,
Which I think is a good move.
That makes a lot of sense to me, and I think that's important because, of course, we want our students to feel comfortable and not feel isolated in some way, which I think goes back to Casey's earlier point about how, in terms of placement, we're always mindful of having students be comfortable. But in terms of special education, how would that play out? So if there are students placed based upon sort of the subtype of IEP or services?
By subtype, do you mean?
Meaning, for example, let's say that there are two students who on their IEP is based around dyslexia. Would they be placed in a class together as a way to economize on resources, or as a way for there to be a greater sense of comfort just from a student knowing that he or she is not the only one who's addressing that as a challenge? Whatever the reasons might be, do we see grouping on that type of basis?
Yeah, we do. But the way that I would look at it is it depends on the students' IEPs and their the teacher's schedule, the special educator schedule. So if we take your example, students with dyslexia, let's say they have a 30-minute reading lesson 5 times a week, so every day. You're going to look to see if there's a teacher schedule in that grade that matches it, so that the special educator can pull you know, X number of these students at the same time because they know that they're receiving the same service, the same support. So there is some grouping to economize there.
To what extent are financial limitations a factor in these decisions?
Some of it is, to be honest, if we know, you know, if we only had that extra special education teacher, then, you know, that person would lighten the load in terms of being able to pull kids. Because the other piece too is on the special ed law side is you can only have X number of students in a pullout. And so there are grouping challenges too. You can increase the group size if you add a para to that grouping, but you know, paras aren't always available because they may be pushing into students, into classrooms to help students in inclusion.
Okay.
That's an added layer as you're thinking about class placements too. Is students who have one-to-one aides and thinking about that dynamic.
Andy, so you'd like to make a comment?
Well, I just had a question again about distribution. So you talked about distributing kids with IEPs and to try to make each class be broadly reflective of the school as a whole. What's the approach for English language learners? Is it similar to that, or is there an attempt to cluster them so that they have people to talk to who are in the same situation?
Yeah, I'm not sure. We'd have to ask Mindy, but my guess is what you just said is that there's obviously a high level of comfort for students who can speak in their native language with another, with peers.
All right. Any other comments on specific language in the current policy or areas that any of you would like to see further developed or modified? All right, so another area that I noticed, going to page J20, the third paragraph seems to address enrichment programming. So the superintendent or his/her designee will provide additional or alternative opportunities for students who demonstrate mastery of the learning expectations in a particular subject area. Mastery will be determined by various and multiple PSB assessments and by school personnel. These opportunities are intended to provide students with a curricular challenge in a setting appropriate to the student's social and emotional development, and will include the possibility of elementary student enrollment in BHS courses, as well as high school student participation at local colleges or universities. Now, I recall that in recent years, there were some 8th graders who were taking math classes at the high school, and I think we pulled back from that. So I'm wondering whether this paragraph is worth revisiting. Do we want to be offering the opportunity for students to take classes at grade levels that are ahead of where they are at by age? Or do we feel that it's important that through differentiation, students stay within their cohorts? So I guess initially the question would be, where are we at right now? Are students allowed, are high school students allowed to take college courses for credit, for example, and are elementary school students able to take classes at the high school?
I'm not entirely sure. We can get that answer.
Okay. And then just from a policy perspective, is that something that we would want to allow? Do any subcommittee members have thoughts on that?
David, especially, I can't speak for the elementary, but especially for the high school, it would be something to actually hear from the high school what they think around that particular piece, because it seems, it seems to me that as a school committee member, I would want to hear a little bit more from the field as to their thinking around whether this is something we should, because they may have a very clear rationale, learning rationale for why that might be a good thing to do.
Jennifer?
I feel like we've had over the last, I don't know, 2 years or so, occasional conversations about this without any, I'm not sure if it might have been in curriculum instead of policy subcommittee, where there has been some discussion, and I'm sure I think it would be a great idea if we could invite some folks from the high school and from the K-8 schools to get, as Dimitri mentioned, sort of get their feedback on the rationale for whether or not this is a good pedagogical decision or not. And so I think that that would be helpful to hear from them. I mean, I can think of some arguments sort of for and against at both the high school level and the elementary. And so I think, that it's worth having a discussion to hear sort of those sides, and perhaps they are in the same situation where in some situations it might be a good idea and for others it's not. And to me, I think it would be maybe more of an exception than the rule. But I do think we would need to get more on the ground, sort of, what is the rationale for supporting this or not, so that we could be informed in our decision-making process.
Andy?
Yeah, I'm also wondering, so that paragraph also mentions the possibility of high school students taking classes at colleges and universities. So if that is going on, like, to what extent do we actually actively support that? Like, do we contribute to tuition and things like that? Or is it just something that is theoretically possible, but we don't proactively make it happen?
We have a comment from a member of the public that this bullet point's at odds with what currently seems to be taking place, which is also my impression, because I definitely recall that we were moving back from 8th graders taking classes at the high school. And I think and I do recall discussions as well about being reluctant to offer credit, at least, to high school students who take college classes. So these are issues that have come up recently. But it certainly is in conflict with the current language of this policy. So I definitely second and third those who have said that we really need to get input from both the K-8 and high school administrators, as well as educators who can provide pedagogical considerations behind either maintaining the spirit of what's currently in our policy, as opposed to continuing with what appears to be a very different status quo. Jennifer, I'm curious just if you could perhaps, in a general sense, go over what you see as the pros and the cons.
Well, I think the pro in any situation is wanting to make sure that students are met where they're at and they're being challenged at what we would call like a zone of proximal development, the place where they can most be challenged, but also be supported in that challenge. And so to help students grow. So if kids are ready for something different, I think that, and this is something that I've mentioned over the years now is the need to make sure that we're differentiating within classrooms, so that all students within a classroom, a general ed classroom, an inclusion classroom, are getting what they need, so that students who need support in a specific content area or in a specific skill within a content area are getting the support that they need to move forward with the curriculum, and that students who need to be challenged are getting that challenge. And I don't know that necessarily is just, like an enrichment and challenge, like an ECS thing. It's an everyday thing. It's a lesson by lesson thing. And so, that I think that conversation about differentiating on a lesson level, on a unit level, and a classroom level is part of this conversation. And I just would be interested to hear from other educators and administrators on what they see as the benefits of doing that. And I guess one of the things that I think about is when kids get pushed very far, very fast, we want to make sure that we're getting the depth and not just moving quickly through curriculum pieces, and that students can not only understand the procedural part of things, or the end result. So I think of procedures in mathematics, but if you're also talking about, English or reading, that kids have the depth of understanding of theme, not just that they can read really hard words. And so that we're offering kids not just doing something that is the next level, but is meaningful. And, these are some of the conversations we're having when we talk about curriculum and curriculum subcommittee and the work that Michelle Herman is doing, is that that, you know, I do believe that educators want to make sure that kids are getting a really meaningful and in-depth understanding of content and not moving very quickly. And that's something that is a national issue in education, is that sometimes US education has been, you know, there's a, and I'm failing to remember the name of this standardized assessment that's given in many countries, including ours, where they talk about US education having, being a mile wide and an inch deep. And so, and I don't know, Casey, if you can think what the name of this assessment is, but.
Is this the PISA you're talking about?
Is it the NAEP?
Yes,
PISA?
it's the NAEP. It's the NAEP. It's the national. I can't think of what the acronym is for, but you know, this is just something I think is a really big issue. And you know, to me, it's not just about moving to the next level. It's really having an understanding of the depth and complexity of issues, of content, instead of just moving on. And so, you know, some kids are great at doing sort of the procedures of understanding how to do, say, 2-digit by 2-digit multiplication. But if you ask them what those numbers mean, they don't always understand, can't always explain to you what they're doing. And so that's just as important as moving on to the next level. So those are some reasons that I might think that it's not that we shouldn't always be pushing kids into the next level, but there may be kids who are ready for that and need that. But is there a way for us to do that within their peer group? You know, if kids understand all of the 8th grade mathematics, like what are we doing for those kids to meet their needs, to keep them engaged? But at the same time, you know, that doesn't mean that every 8th grader is ready to go to 9th grade mathematics. I don't know if that's helpful, David, but that's sort of a very big overview kind of, you know, I could see where there might be times when kids are needed, but are there ways that we can challenge those kids without sending them to the high school to do that work, you know, within that 8th grade classroom? So
yeah, I completely agree with you, Jennifer. And I think the question I have is, what is policy's place in supporting that? You know, because a lot of it is driven by teacher development and I mean, these are just best instructional practices, right? So where's that connection?
And I do think that there's a PD piece to this in supporting educators and doing this work, because it does take work to be able to support many different levels of learners. But
Totally.
But I do believe, it is my belief that that is good for students, that being able to, we need to be able to meet their needs.
Yep.
And we need to be able to support them wherever they're at and make the experience meaningful. And you can differentiate a lesson to meet many different levels of learners within the same lesson. And so, but it takes time and it takes development, it takes practice, and it takes, you know, creating resources to do that and working together. And I think that's one of the great benefits of, if we could, you know, have teachers have more time for PD across grade levels. And then it goes to, we've been talking about this horizontal alignment and vertical alignment within our curriculum in Brookline. And so I do think that, I think there's a lot of room for discussion and thought about this before we make policy decisions. So, you know, I think it helps to understand a little bit of what's on the ground and the theory of why we do what we do and the choices that we make.
Any other thoughts on this policy? It sounds like the direction that we want to go in is getting more information about what's actually taking place right now to better inform whether we want to stick with what the policy is currently stating or depart from it. I am of the firm belief that regardless of what we ultimately decide, we do want our policies to, our actions at least, to reflect our policies and vice versa. So it does concern me a little bit that current practices seem to be opposite what our policy states. Again, that might be the right decision, but then we need to adjust the policy accordingly. Andy, I see that you want to make a comment.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to go back to the ELL piece for a moment. I'm not sure, again, whether this is just practice or whether it's something that policy should or could address. But, you know, insofar as it is our practice to try to cluster ELL kids together, I wonder whether we could take a look at whether that's really the direction we want to encourage. I mean, I'm kind of aware of this just because I happen to be at a school with an enormous number of Chinese speakers. And, you know, there are certainly upsides to clustering them in certain classes, but I've heard about downsides as well. I mean, it actually makes it harder for the kids to learn English if they're in there with, you know, many other Chinese speakers. And it also definitely has an impact on the other kids in the class. you know, when half or more of their classmates are not that proficient in English yet. So again, I don't know whether this is something for policy to take up.
Jennifer?
I think that if there are sections of our policy that address that, I think that it would be helpful to hear from Mindy on what does current research and practice indicate. I do think that many of our policies are, in my opinion, outdated, and I'm not sure that that's something that we would all, I think we would maybe all agree on that we are updating these for a purpose, and that, you know, practice, we learn all the time about, you know, how we best can support students. And so I just would be interested in hearing if it's part of our policy, you know, from Mindy or someone in the department about what is current best practice. And, you know, this is, once we can get into a place where our policies are updated, you know, many districts take 10 and review them every year and rotate them through and just say, like, is this our current practice? Is this our best practice? Is this what we believe is the right thing to do? And I think we're going back, what did you say, 97?
Yes.
So, you know, 20 years of, you know, current practice has happened since then about what is best instructional practice. And I think we should base our policies on what we believe is best practice. And so I think it may be helpful, to Andy's point, I think, to hear from some people about what it is that is best practice, and to make sure, David, to your point, that our policies align to that best practice.
And Jennifer, if I could only supplement what you just said, that in addition to hearing from Mindy and others, again, I think we want to lean to allowing the folks in the field, teachers, principals in the schools, to make those decisions. I mean, they know the kids well. I think, again, I want to give as much as possible. I would want to defer to them on class composition and not have it being dictated by us. But I do agree, we want to make sure that our policy and practice align. But as much as we can hear from them, sort of their thoughts as well on these issues, because I think we want to give room and flexibility to them.
Jennifer?
Yeah, I think that's makes a lot of sense to me, Dimitri, about we need to maintain that flexibility. And so I guess I think it would be helpful for, you know, for educators and administrators and departments and the school district as a whole to engage in the conversation. If this is a good forum for that, then that's great. And it helps educate us as well, so that we can think about, like, perhaps there should be a maximum. I don't think we should be setting the numbers. You know, that's certainly not in our purview in policy. I don't think that's the intention, but, you know, it may be helpful to foster that conversation and say, like, at a certain tipping point, it's not productive for ELs, you know, for our students, whatever the population, or the general, you know, the entire population of students, to have us, you know, certain guidelines, and maybe that it's just good to have that conversation, and that's not part of the policy.
All right, we have a member of the public who's commenting about CST as one of the inputs for educational setting, that this is something we might want to look at, but there's some complexity to how CST currently works with a 6-month wait time in some schools. Casey, do you want to comment on that?
I don't have enough information about that.
All right, would anyone else, does anyone else have anything to say about the student grouping, inclusion, and placement practices policy? Any final thoughts on it for today's discussion, or questions or other things to follow up on?
Maybe, can I just get some clarity on the student grouping and all the piece, and including the thing that Andy just raised with ELL? What's the follow-up?
So I think the follow-up is we definitely need input to know what's actually taking place. I think that. So I am going to, Casey's already done some of this. We're going to reach out to others who would be in the best position to articulate what's actually taking place in the buildings, how these decisions are being made, why they are being made, and that will inform us as to whether we want to defer, as you said, which would probably be my position as well, to what the current practices are, and also what are best practices in that field in particular, not just what's going on at the school, but what's going on nationwide or even internationally in these different areas to handle these issues. And then from there, we can determine whether the language in the policy ought to be altered. But just right now, the way certain provisions are phrased, they seem to run contrary to what we're actually doing. So I just want to make sure that we're aligned.
So David, I just maybe raise the point or ask the question, and if it hasn't been done, to verify, but I noticed the policy was 1987. And I also noticed that MASC sample policies don't have this policy anymore. So I'm just wondering if MASC or Ed Reform, 1993 Ed Reform sort of eliminated the school committee's role in having a policy. So the work that you're doing is great work, but would be more of guidance rather than a policy, because it's not under the school committee's auspices due to Ed Reform in 1993. I'm running into that with a lot of the finance policies, is that Ed Reform and some subsequent law changes, you know, sort of negate some of the language and why that language hasn't been updated. So that's just a question. Before you get too far down into policies, what kind of document are you really producing or need to produce?
So just in terms of the dates that you're referencing, at least what I have on page J19, it says that this policy was originally approved on January 9th, 1997, and then portions of it were revised in 2010.
It's just a good check, because I'm not, it's just a good check.
Okay.
Because I thought it was curious, there isn't or at least the MASC doesn't have a sample. I was trying to find a sample policy with MASC, and they have a sample policy for practically everything.
All right. Next up, we have a discussion of the policy on student rights and responsibilities. And this is going way back. The last time that this was addressed was 1971. Now, in this policy, we will definitely, in my view, need to revise some of the language, because the yearbook is specifically mentioned here in passing and other school publications. And since we have just passed a new yearbook policy, I would also want to make sure that we're aligned with student rights and responsibilities. And it's also an important area more broadly, well beyond yearbooks. So we have any initial thoughts on how the policy currently reads and changes that anybody might want to make, or additions, or areas where we could use some input?
David, I'm sorry. I just want to make sure that when I am looking at my J34 is not on this. So I'm just wondering whether there's a different in pages or something. Because my J34 is about confidentiality of records. So maybe I'm reading in the wrong place, but.
How about you, Andy? Is your J34 student rights and responsibilities, or something? It is?
Yeah, it is.
It is?
Yeah, it's page 332 in the PDF version I have. But...
So in the meantime, while Dimitri's looking for that, an interesting theme in this policy that I notice is essentially the right for students to very directly petition for particular changes, both in policies and in terms of coursework. And I'm wondering if someone can speak to current practices around that. Now, this probably occurs more at the high school level than in the K through 8s.
Yeah, you're correct. And I don't have any information on that.
Mary Ellen, do you have anything you could comment on with this with respect to how are students currently empowered to pursue independent studies, for instance, or the creation of new classes, publications, clubs? This policy seems to address a lot of
that. So student clubs and organizations are governed by the student activities policy, which we have a revision for, and that actually we can bring that is Michael and I worked on that a few years ago. So that's ready to actually come back. With regards to independent studies and all of that, that's under the high school handbook, and how that actually can happen. And whether those are credit recovery. Again, I don't know if that's also an ed reform part under the school. I was just looking at the MASC guidance. So that's all. I don't have enough information on the independent studies other than it's typically through the high school handbook and course selection and the requirements that they lay out.
From a philosophical perspective, I see you have a comment, Jennifer?
I was just going to say, I think in the attachment that you and I have, Dimitri, it's going to be J40 is the section in this doc. Did you find it already? Okay.
Thank you. I did. Yeah. J40. Thanks.
Yep.
Yep.
Sorry. No, I'm just trying to find the same document that Dimitri's trying to find. It wasn't in the same place in my document.
From a philosophical perspective, and obviously we would want to have input from administrators before making any final determinations. But do we like the idea of empowering students to create their own courses and to implement changes? I personally do, but I'm wondering what others think. Andy?
Well, do we know roughly how many students actually take advantage of this opportunity now?
That would be a good thing to find out, Andy. I know that it used, at least when I was at the high school, it was much more popular in X Block, where a lot of the X Block activities, some students would actually design, offer, work with a faculty advisor and offer it. But it would be good to know what the status of that is. But generally, I am in favor of that.
I also think we have some alternative programs at the high school where students may have, where you see this more often. So SWS and the ACE program. It may be helpful, David, if you're thinking maybe for the February program meeting, we can bring in a number of high school folks to talk about a number of these policies.
Because looking at number 5, for example, the students in each classroom should be encouraged to assume some responsibility for shaping individual classroom procedures and evaluating instructional materials. That's a lot of more influence than I'm guessing students currently have. And also, this is not even qualified for high school only. Jennifer?
I mean, I think that's a really general statement. And I think that you could probably come up, like I already in my mind can come up with several examples of how that might work in a K-8 school. Most, I hesitate to use the word most, but in some classrooms, it is common for students to be involved in the creation of classroom rules and procedures at the beginning of the year. So that qualifies under here. I think it's, very different to say that students in younger classrooms, they might help to, academic choice is another really big thing, which is part of responsive classroom and allowing students to have academic choice in things that they study. But then there are other things that are required and they're not necessarily typically subject to debate. So I think that I'm not sure what they meant when they created this document. And so I think that we should know what we mean when we have a policy and what, not necessarily what that implementation of procedures looks like, but what is the intention and intentionality behind this? Is it just to be broad and say student voice should be an important part, in which case we may be doing that. And I think it's very different at the high school where students may be in a much greater way directing the course itself or the materials that are used. So I think it can just mean so many different things that it's subject to so much interpretation. I just think we should know what we mean, at least in the policy.
Yes. I find it similarly interesting that number 3, all departments are encouraged to involve students in the development and evaluation of curriculum. This involves student participation in curriculum workshops. I would be surprised if much of that is happening, at least in a formal way. It's an interesting thought. Go ahead, Jennifer.
I was just thinking about like in a place that this might apply, and it is good to get student feedback. I know that part of, okay, so a couple of thoughts. One, like I'm wondering if in our math curriculum review, if there were student members. I know there were parent members of the curriculum, math curriculum review committees when they were doing a lot of that work with Kathleen Hubbard, and I know parents were involved. I know teachers were involved. I can't remember if they were students or not, or, you know, sort of student focus groups might be interesting when we're doing sort of curriculum review, which doesn't always happen every year. And the other thought I had was that I feel like it may even be part of like the DESE requirements on evaluator feedback. I think that it is typical that some form of feedback is collected from students, and it can be connected to an educator's goals. And so what that could be a social, there's lots of goals you can have that you can create, but typically some sort of student feedback is part of that feedback loop. It's not on anything and everything, you know, it's typically around that, but I do think there are mechanisms where this may happen, but that's not governed by our policy necessarily. That's a DESE guideline. And it's an interesting idea to think about what that looks like from implementation. And, you know, we're just doing a policy piece here, but again, I'm just curious of what is the intention of the policy designed to do? What is the purpose of it?
So David, as I look at this, I'm not surprised it was voted in 71. I mean, I think this is a time when Brookline was really big about a democratic high school. And the whole idea of really creating a democratic education. We were at the time a real model for how to involve students in shaping the learning. And I'm assuming these are some of the leftovers. However, when I look at number 3 and some of these other ones, they actually line up with a lot of what the equity field today is speaking of. So they're allowing students, particularly students who come out of particular lived realities, to have the option or the ability to shape or be in conversation with educational decision maker, right? Around what courses are being offered, what is the curriculum, or what resources you're using. Is it exclusionary? Is it balanced, and so on? So that the decision is not left solely to the educators, but that they do it in conversations. So if you were to apply an equity lens, some of these things have relevance today. I don't know how much of a practice they are, but a lot of this is the leftover of the democratic school thing of the 70s.
I think there are a lot of benefits to having students involved and engaged. I mean, you're going to increase student engagement and their willingness to do work when they have an investment in it. So, I mean, I think there are a lot of upsides to looking at curriculum this way. Again, it would be an interesting conversation to sort of see what that looks like on the ground and what is the intention of our policy and how much of a commitment. Again, we can say that something is a policy and then we look at the implementation and, you know, what is the PD around that? What is the investment that the district is making to do that? It's great to have a policy, and it's even better to have a policy that's implemented, you know, with much higher fidelity. But it's a commitment. It's a commitment to a philosophy in some ways.
Right, I agree with you, Jennifer. I really like the idea of empowering students in this way and including them so directly in terms of helping to shape the curriculum. And I only mean that in a very broad sense. Obviously, they're not going to be devising all the lesson plans and determining which textbooks to use and that sort of thing. But the way you framed it around sort of having perhaps focus groups so we can understand what seems to work and what doesn't work and what students enjoy and don't necessarily enjoy and what they benefit from and not benefit from. And if they can see that they're having a direct impact in shaping it, it might make them more engaged and enjoy learning more. If they're seeing that it's more of an interplay as opposed to just having it dictated to them completely. And then to Dimitri's point, I really like the idea of looking through this policy with an equity lens. And I think that does potentially tie in quite nicely. Any other comments or questions or specific areas of input that we should request before we next address this policy? All right, seeing none, can move on to our next policy that's up for discussion, which at least for Andy and I can be found on J84. Might be a bit somewhere else for you and Jennifer, Dimitri. And that is the special services policy. And this was last updated in 1975. So Mary Ellen, I'll give an initial question to you. Are you aware of any legislation that would render parts of this obsolete?
Probably quite a bit. There's probably quite a bit. I'm trying to get to the same page. I'm having a version thing that Jennifer and Dimitri are having.
It's J90, I think.
I know, it's, I
Right,
got.
just scrolling
just-
down to get to it is quite a.
75. So
What's it? Why does it say?
I don't think
Dr.
this
McKenzie-
eligibility of non-public pupils for special services is actually valid anymore. I think this is tied into the, if special services is special education, that's already tied into what Casey does, and that's all it is governed by regulation. So you potentially could delete this policy. I don't see a similar one in the MASC, just by title, just as a quick scan for title. Same with the special education mediation hearings, litigation, that's all regulation now. In school observations, that's all regulation now. Casey can confirm. And then I don't know if you want to get into student fees, fines, and charges, because they're, we did an update to that. So if you're just talking about to J93.
Right.
Yeah, I think these are all updated through regulation and requirements and case law, in that you don't need a policy because case law is going to govern and override your any policy.
A policy, though, can of course provide additional rights that are not
But
the
yeah, my role advises you against that, as those have budgetary consequences and are exceeding FAPE and what the requirements are. So I think you should have Casey review this, but I believe a lot of this would have is already being met through the IEP process and the requirements that we have for our resident students that attend a private school and services that have IEPs.
Now, the
Can make your
portions
manual
of it,
shorter.
the portions of it that do not have financial implications or non-obvious financial implications, such as number 4 under special education mediation hearings litigation, which is more about notification to school committee about pending litigation and about deadlines. Do you see any value to having something like that in a policy, or do you feel this is already covered elsewhere?
That I think you would have more authority and power through your job descriptions and your job expectations of your superintendent and your director of special education, both of whom you appoint. So Casey, we're talking about J90 through 93. And they appear to be what I would view as items that are currently well-regulated through special education guidance and regulation and statutes and or case law. And that you're probably already doing them because of all of that.
Let me just pull it up. So J90.
Yep.
I mean, just a quick scan, special ed law would cover many of this, if not all. I'm not sure about in-school observations of special ed programs.
We had regulation around that when I was in Lexington that we ran into.
Yeah, it actually calls out specific law. Is the question whether or not we still need this section, David?
Yes. Are these current policies that haven't been touched since the 1970s, are they already addressed elsewhere and by state law, or do we need to preserve elements of this and modify them?
Yeah, I mean, if I could have some time and look at each and every one of them, I can get you a more thorough answer.
Casey, I was doing an initial MASC review look, and it doesn't look like they're there.
Okay.
So I was sort of queuing up that they could be eliminated because law, regulation, and then case law would have taken care of this.
Yep.
And I think notification, David had the question about notification of the school committee of various litigation and other items that he viewed as not having a cost, whether that would be something to keep in policy, or is that just generally done?
That the notification would not?
That notification to school committee members of impending litigation and or some case go to school committee, right?
Currently, the policy, if you go to number 4 under special education, mediation, hearings, and litigations, there's language about notification to school committee of pending litigation and litigation deadlines. And I'm not sure that this is in accord with current practice. Now, I'm not saying that this is something that we absolutely need, but I'm curious as to whether policy should be addressing this in your opinion, as well as in the opinions of subcommittee members, whether we feel this is something that is important enough that it should be codified in our policy, or whether we should trust, as I hope we would in a general sense, that anything that's really pressing in terms of litigation that we would be informed of anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would want to know that what falls under litigation. So special education hearings, which it seems like that would be under here. I'm not sure I would need to inform the school committee, because what do you need to know that information for? And, oftentimes it's also a lot of confidential information, unless it's more for Mary Ellen's, for a financial reason in terms of how much a hearing would cost potentially.
Well, you don't have a choice when you go into my experience on the special ed side is you don't have a choice. You're going into that hearing or litigation regardless. It's rare that the district takes a family to court. That does happen. Those are conversations with school committee. But I think the regulations cover the notification and what districts are to school committees. I mean, we'd notify the school committee through, by the way, we have X number of litigations happening in special ed. I've had that happen with the school committee. It's like 2 or 3 or 5, but it's not the specific cases because they don't get to know or didn't get to know. Again, because it's too much information, you're in public meeting and it's not executive session exempt. So I think that's where you run into the notification method being problematic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I would see value to at least number 5 of not necessarily the specifics, but just understanding the volume. So that we have some idea about the flow of litigation, whether There are fewer cases in a given year compared to a previous year, and why we have fewer cases. So sort of similar to the discussion around the recently passed anti-discrimination harassment policy, where we really made the reporting part a lot more robust. I think something similar in this context would be worthwhile. It doesn't necessarily have to be in this policy or how this is phrased, but I think having that information provided to both the superintendent and the school committee would be useful.
Yeah, I agree.
Jennifer?
Yeah, I mean, I would, to whatever extent school committee can be notified of this information, I think it's helpful for us to have some understanding. I don't know what the rules and laws are. Maybe town council or our council has, you know, information and feedback on this, David, that they would be able to give us, you know, information about what information is too much information, what's appropriate, but some level of reporting and what that is, I think is helpful for us to understand the scope of what's happening in the district. We often, I think it's also helpful, and sometimes we get information from community members that's not specific, that may just say there is a pending insert XYZ case or complaint, and we don't, you know, it would just be helpful to be able to understand the context and the larger scope of what's happening in the district, the health of the district, so to speak, of how it's functioning.
Yeah, I mean, the way I'm imagining a quarterly report would be number of cases and then the trends that I'm seeing versus going into any specifics.
And Mary Ellen or Casey, do you have a suggestion about where that quarterly report policy should appear? Should it appear in a heavily revised special education mediation hearings litigations policy, or do you think we could tack it onto something else?
I actually don't think it should be a policy. I think it should be, you know, from the finance subcommittee, what is the quarterly financial report contents that you want to see?
But it's not just a financial question, at least for me. It's also about what's actually taking place, even if there's no financial loss to the district whatsoever. I would want to know trends in special education filings of any sort.
Yeah, so that would be, I mean, a place to put it is there. It's not that there's a loss. It's that you're reporting out how your dollars, you know, your legal services budget is being expended, how special education dollars are being expended. So it's a place. And it's, you know, I guess I was thinking because it's one of the few places that like special ed, the other place would be, special ed doesn't really have a subcommittee. I mean, you've got curriculum subcommittee, you've got finance subcommittee, but special education has CPAC but it doesn't really have a subcommittee of the school committee. I'm not advocating a new subcommittee, but so I was looking at kind of where could that information go that had a context that would cross a number of different interests, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think the closest, oftentimes I can tell you hearings activity is around programming. And so the closest place would be curriculum subcommittee, but it's not often about curriculum as it is about placement and specialized programming in our district. I mean, I'm happy to report out to a larger at a larger school committee meeting and provide, I mean, I don't know if quarterly is too much. Usually litigation spans months. So maybe it's twice a year. But I don't know, to Mary Ellen's point, how much of this is policy versus practice. I'm happy to put into practice, starting with spring semester, a special education update. And one of the topics can be litigation or hearings activity.
Jennifer?
I do think that these policies have been around, the ones that we're reviewing in many cases, right, for a long, long time, and they will be here long after any of us is putting anything into practice, hopefully. So I do think that putting some of this into policy is important, just so that things happen after, you know, in the future, that we may want to put into practice, but I think having something in the policy helps to make sure that it continues to happen. Does that make sense?
Yes, I agree with you, Jennifer. I think that we may have the best of intentions in the present to have effective practices, but that's no guarantee that 20 years from now, whoever is working in the district and whatever the composition of the school committee might be, I'm sure Helen will still be there, but I don't know about for everyone else, that whether they would still be adhering to that practice. So I think it is important to bake that in to the policy. Then the question is just where to put it, whether we keep this and strip it down, because a lot of it is covered in other areas now. But I would like to see it in writing somewhere, because I think policies certainly inform what the practices will be, and they offer some reassurance to the community that there are existing practices and that something is being done. And there's a tremendous amount of interest of reviewing these reports. We just had this discussion again in the context of harassment and discrimination, and I think it's equally, if not even more important, in the context of special education.
David, I'm wondering whether we should have something for the school committee that says that we should be reviewing these school policies every 5 years. Like it's kind of crazy that we're looking at something that's written in 71, 75. Should we just make it that the school committee ought to have a regular period of time when it pauses and reviews policies?
Dimitri, are you suggesting a policy on policies? Is that what I just heard?
No, I'm suggesting either a policy or a protocol for school committee to be responsible for reviewing these on a regular.
MASC actually has a draft policy on that. I'll forward it to you, Dimitri.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
To your point, I've worked with school committees that have had policies of practice that the policy subcommittee takes a third of the policy manual and reads through it every year to make sure about what are the edits, what are the law changes. And then they give to the staff, senior staff, typically, their portion of that 1/3 of that section and say, okay, what do you know that has changed or edited and updated? And then we focus in on, staff would give a proposal for the edit and change based on DESE guidance and all of that. And then it would go and follow the same kind of first, second, third reading practice. And so presumably you would get through 1/3 of that big book, because if you were doing that on a regular basis, you're pretty current at that point.
Yeah.
It's when you have something like we're working with, which has not had that practice, that it's a big slog.
Yeah, totally. Just for what it's worth, I was born in 1971. It's kind of nice to see the legacy.
I would point out that the last of the 3 subsections here was put in much more recently, in 2010, in response to a law that was passed in 2008. So I think even though there was a new law, I guess it was felt, at least at the time, that didn't remove the need for a policy. That's the one on in-school observations.
And with regard to in-school observations, Casey, can you talk a little bit about how that currently works?
So we do have, let me just make sure I'm referencing the same thing. We have families who come and observe our special education programs when their child is recommended for that program. We generally have parents sign a confidentiality agreement, because when they come to visit, of course, they'll see students who are on IEPs. I haven't read this policy, but that's the more broad practice right now. And then we always have an administrator accompany the parent.
So it's always parents only? Can community members come in? Because a concern I would have would be, how do we maintain confidentiality if we have random members of the public observing students while they're receiving
Yeah, no, we don't have that. This would only be for it's student specific. And so it's a caregiver. It's not always a parent, but we also have had parents give permission for someone who is working on that student's team. So a mental health professional who oversees the student's care. We've had psychologists who have evaluated a student for an independent evaluation, and to add to their report. There are times when we've allowed it, but we keep it pretty tight in terms of who's allowed to come and observe a program.
And how does that work if the student is receiving services in the group of other students receiving similar services? Because then we're not necessarily protecting the confidentiality of those other students who are not related to the parent or caregiver or provider in question. Would we separate the student for services on that particular day of observation?
So when parents come to observe a program, their student is not yet in that program. And so we don't change anything in terms of schedules or grouping. So parents will come and we let them know that students are now, at this part of their schedule, they'll be transitioning to the next piece. And then, a teacher will, any adult working with the student will inevitably use a student name. And that's where the identification piece could come in.
I see.
But really it's to observe how the program is working, who's involved, what does it look like, what does the classroom look like.
Any other thoughts on this grouping of policies? All right, seeing none, we're ready to move on to the next item, which is policies that are currently under consideration by the full school committee. And the reason why I had put this down in our itinerary for today was just in case one of the policies we recently voted had not yet been approved, so we could work on tinkering that some more today. But we do have the school committee norms, which is still somewhat actively being drafted. Do we have any further developments on that, Dimitri, or anyone else? You're on mute, Dimitri.
So I do have an update. I did manage to get hold of copies of norms that are being used in Concord and in Cambridge that I'm reading through, and I'm just sort of this was mostly around sort of the communication between school committee and staff. So I looked at both Cambridge and Concord, what they have. So I'm using that to just go back into that section and write up. My sense is once we do that, that's the last item. So I can do that and I can redistribute to all of you the updated document this week. And I think, David, I can let you know, but I think we might be ready to bring it to the school committee. Is it the 21st? Because I think the 14th, I think it's when I think we're in a workshop or something like that. So I think we should be ready for the 21st, but I will redistribute. Once I have a chance to go in and put the language for all of you to read, I think it might be ready for us to bring it up on the 21st.
All right, sounds good. Andy, Jennifer, any other components for school committee norms that you think we should be looking to add or modify, or do we just want to wait for the next draft distribution? Jennifer?
I think that was one of my areas of concern, was that communication channel and sort of just clarifying it. So I think for me, I'd like to just wait till the next revision comes out and look at it then and do more feedback. I'm sorry, Andy, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, I mean, the only other thing I remember kind of being discussed was how we handle communications with the public. But then I'm not sure the discussion got anywhere because every solution we came up with had some serious flaws.
My impression was that at least among the four of us, we mostly favored status quo, just in the sense of providing enough flexibility and trust in ourselves to not overwhelm staff with too many direct requests, but at the same time to not create this regimented structure by which everything gets routed through the superintendent and the chair. Because that creates an overwhelming amount of work for those two individuals. It's actually an inefficient way of pursuing certain objectives. So at least to me, we actually want to be maybe a little more flexible around that communication piece. I feel the same way when it comes to answering emails to the public. I would love for everyone to be able to get a response, but at the same time, there are definitely occasions where the volume is just way too high for that to happen. And to designate only 1 or 2 people to respond to all emails would be really overwhelming. If 9 of us can't do it, we certainly can't expect 1 or 2 to be able to do it.
Yeah, I can look at what, since I'm looking at the stuff that we have from these other committees to see how they handle that, David. My sense is it looks like in some communities, what they actually do is a triage, right? If there's a particularly hot item for discussion in the community at the moment, that's when the chair and the vice chair, right, would probably get involved and communication is going through them. But if it's regular kind of stuff in the spirit of everybody gets a response, individual committee members are allowed to speak for themselves and respond to constituents.
Yes. All right. Any more thoughts on the school committee norms? All right. Seeing none. Next up, we have new business. So under new business, I'd like to ask Mary Ellen for your thoughts on, you brought up earlier the student activities policy. What specifically are you referencing? Do you have a page number on that? Because when I look through, it seems like it's somewhat spread out in a lot of different places.
Well, it is in, I believe it's in the fiscal, it's part of section D, fiscal management. It's D18. And there have been significant revisions and clarifications in the statutes, the 1997 statute that put student activities in place. And so what's here doesn't actually really cut it at all. What's in the manual, like even if you just looked at the MASC version, it doesn't cut it. Ours is a little bit more extensive. Recommendations from our new auditors that we have for student activities, which is not our, which is Clark and Roselli, or Roselli and Clark, sorry, is that we look at what the DESE audit guidelines are and the guidance is, and sort of create policy around those. So that's part of what we did when Michael was chair. He did some additional work to kind of streamline it. So I think it's ready to come back to this committee and have a review. We have, I think it's ready to come back to this committee and have a review, and finance needs to do some work on student activities as well. So it could be tied together with the joint meeting.
And do you have some timetable on when you think that could be ready?
What student activities is ready now, the others are not.
In terms of the financial, the section D, so doing that comprehensive review? Do you think that's
I don't know. I have to talk to Mariah. I think I will be including it as part of, I believe, our agenda for the next, for Thursday, but I'm still finishing up my edits on this because there's so many things in here that should not, I mean, this needs an overhaul. Frankly, I would rather start with the MASC section D for fiscal management and go from there, based on kind of what I'm reading through.
all right? Well, whatever you think is best, but I would like us to be able to go over that section D overhaul.
Oh yeah. No, I 100%. It needs 100%. It needs updating badly.
David,
Yes.
I just want to point out that we have something from the public. So
Yes,
it's in the chat.
there is a question about placements when there are allegations of assault or harassment. I do think Casey touched upon this earlier on in our meeting tonight, but if you want to recapitulate how placement works in those situations where there are concerns about bullying and harassment.
I don't have anything in addition to add to that. To what I said earlier is they do take into consideration. I know that there have been some more complicated cases related to assault and harassment and how it's placed, but that's more, the ones that I've seen have been at the high school, and it's a little bit, the placement process is a little bit different at the high school, obviously. But certainly if those things are taken into consideration, Maria Litas is generally involved, and then of course, high school administrators. And in the case that it would be a K-8 student, then of course the admin at the K-8 schools would be involved. And there's a confidentiality piece though with teachers in terms of how much they need to know and not know. There's sensitivity around that too.
Okay. Then just sort of a general question I'd like to ask subcommittee members as well as staff that are present. Are there any pressing issues that you feel need to be taken up by this subcommittee? Certain policies in question that we ought to be working on or prioritizing to reflect present needs or challenges?
I don't have anyone that comes directly to mind, but I think that it would be great if you ask this of the principals who implement these policies day in and day out.
Okay. Any other thoughts from anyone?
I don't, David.
All right, Andy, Jennifer, Mary Ellen. Okay, in that case, that concludes this evening's policy subcommittee meeting. Thank you to everyone who participated, as well as to the members of the public who tuned in. And our next meeting will be the second Monday in February.